Now, where to begin? I'll just start with the sort of formalities. My name is Sean Sweeney. I direct the International Programme for Labour, Climate and Environment here at the Murphy Institute. And also, this Murphy Institute is a home of a project called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. And in my opening comments, I'll say a couple of things about that. But I, first of all, want to frame it by saying how the speakers are going to run and get that dealt with. We're going to start with a presentation from Miriam Greenberg from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her bio's in the program, so she'll forgive me if we don't go into too much details about that. But her research is in the areas of urban studies, cultural studies, and dealing with cities as an important place for struggle, for movements around not just environment and anti-capitalism, but to carve alternatives, which intersects with the ecological crisis. Jacob Remus from NYU is going to respond, give us 10 or 15 minutes of comments responding to Miriam's presentation. And lastly, we have Maritza Silva Farrell, who is the Executive Director of Align, which is a coalition here of unions and community groups and environmental organizations working for a more sustainable and greener New York. I should say also Maritza is the recipient of the Murphy Institute's Rising Leader Award 2018. So we'll give her, please, a round of applause. And so we're looking forward to an exciting and interesting panel. I think that we can take great hope from this subject, despite the title. We're in a period of history where there's so much change going on, but there's so many opportunities for new radical movements to challenge the system and, some of us believe, overthrow or get rid of this system eventually, one way or another. And I think the title of the conference, The Future of Capitalism, raises a question for me. Does capitalism have a future if it continues to treat the earth and its ecosystems that sustain life as a dumping ground for its waste products, whether that be carbon emissions or other forms of pollution? So and I wanted to, as I say these words, acknowledge the passing of Joel Koval, a leading eco-socialist writer, who was really a pioneer. 20 years ago, I believe, he wrote a book, Enemies of Nature, and he was part of a small group of socialists who thought that the ecological crisis deserved more attention. And it dawned on me, and I think it dawned on him a lot earlier, that if we're looking as leftists and Marxists for crisis tendencies in capitalism, and I know I spent many hours in my political youth talking about those issues, then we've got a crisis tendency in capitalism right here that is of a civilizational nature, that is empirically verifiable, and that is the crisis of the ecosystems, and particularly the climate crisis, which threatens everybody. And the slogan of the international trade union community, there are no jobs on a dead planet, I think sums up the situation as far as capitalism is concerned. Now, I wanted to also make reference to the fact that I think that the last session reminded me that this is very much a new economy, 21st century kind of discussion. But it's the old economy in many ways that's really messing up the ecology. We are not in a post-industrial phase. And globally, if we just look at the data, and it comes out in the data around energy, and understanding what's going on in the energy system is crucial to knowing how we stabilize the climate, how we reduce emissions, because most emissions come from energy. And I just want to give a few facts to illustrate what's going on. Take, for example, the consumption of coal, oil, and gas in the last 25 years has virtually doubled. Now think of that in historical terms. Here we've had 250 years of capitalism, and those very inputs into the capitalist system have doubled in a very, very short period of time. And it's no wonder why they've doubled. Let's take the motor industry, for example. Very soon, The annual sales for motor vehicles will hit 90 million, which is more than 4 times the annual sales of the late 1960s at the peak of the post-war expansion. We've also got the issue of the emissions levels, of course, from energy are rising dramatically. There's been a lot of talk that we're stabilizing the climate, we're stabilizing the emissions levels. For 2 years, carbon dioxide emissions flattened, largely due to the slowdown in China. But what has happened over this year, of course, they've risen again, and now we're at a trajectory that we're facing 4, 5, or 6 degrees Celsius of planetary warming, atmospheric warming, by the end of the century. And of course, scientists are getting hysterical about this. But one thing we have learned is that market approach that's based on polluter pays principles of incentivizing the green economy, of putting a price on the emissions, has been a complete and utter disaster. And for 10 years ago, I think, and I was talking earlier about this, 10 years ago, I would have certainly said, look, maybe that's the only way we're going to do this. We don't have the strength to put forward a different narrative. But 10 years have gone and they've completely failed to slow down the increase in emissions. And they're getting more and more terrified at the prospects of what's going to happen. So where do we come in and where does this conversation fit in? We're at a point where we have to take ownership politically of the transition to a low carbon economy and a more sustainable political economy. There is no one else out there who is going to do it. Anybody out there who's in this space, with a few exceptions, are motivated by one thing only, and that is to make money. The serious players in the economy of the green economy are doing it to raise money for themselves. So the neoliberal approach to climate protection, ecological protection, has completely failed. And that is not a cause for celebration, but neither is it a cause for despair. If ever there was an argument that we had at our disposal that capitalism is a system that should end, and the quicker it ends, the better, and the only people who can make it end is ourselves, that's a message that I think should inspire the remainder of this conversation and the remainder of this conversation. So I'll start off by asking Miriam to come forward, and she's got her presentation, and we can hear what she's got to say in the context of her own work and how she's looking at these issues. Thanks, Miriam.
Great. And one thing I realized is that my presentation is actually in the wrong mode. Let me see. Oh, thank you so much. I don't know how that happened exactly. And my eyesight is really not able to deal with that screen. Yeah. Oh, great. Thank you. Okay. So thank you, Sean, and thank you, Stephanie and Ruth and everyone for organizing this conference, Sam and everyone I've been communicating with. It's really an honor to be here with all of you. And I feel like we're having similar conversations at UC Santa Cruz and in California, and it's great to kind of combine them with what's happening here, as well as to return to CUNY, my alma mater, and at the Grad Center, and to just be connected to a lot of ongoing conversations that my research has also touched on and that relates to this conference. So I was asked to speak on this question, and I'm going to go to it, which you probably can't see. I should have made it larger, but I will read it to you. So the question is, what is the impact of the ecological crisis and the political failure to address it for the future of capitalism and the future of work? So I spent a lot of time mulling over that question. I had all kinds of other ideas for what I might do, but I was supposed to answer this question, and it actually, the more I thought about it, the greater I realized this question was. So I kind of broke it down into 3 parts, and they're color coordinated, and you can't see the color coordinated parts of them probably, but I was pretty proud of myself. So I broke it down into the ecological crisis, the political failure to address it, and the implications of all of this for the future of capitalism and the future of work. So I'm going to be organizing my talk along these lines. And I should say with the first one, I'm going to be thinking about the ecological crisis in terms of an urban ecological crisis, and I'll be talking about why I think that's an important move, and its meanings and dynamics. And then along those lines, the politics of crisis, the politics of urban environmental crises, from disaster capitalism to something I'm going to call radical ruptures and the opportunities that have been and could be presented by this for more really progressive and radical organizing. And then finally, the implications of all of this for the future of work and capitalism in these contexts. So first, I wanted to just explain a bit that a lot of these ideas I'm drawing are from some different works. The first is a book called Crisis Cities, Disaster and Redevelopment in New York and New Orleans that I co-authored with Kevin Fox Gotham, and looked at the politics of both pre- and post-disaster redevelopment in those two cities and comparatively. And then a project I've been working on in California for the last few years called Critical Sustainabilities. So, insofar as cities are often held up to be kind of the primary culprit of the ecological crisis, and many cities and urban dwellers are the primary victims, cities are also held up to be the primary solution, often, to the crisis, primarily in terms of approaches to urban sustainability. And California and Northern California, where I'm located, it is considered a kind of mecca for urban sustainability. So together with a lot of other faculty and grad students, I've been working a lot on sort of the history of the concept of sustainability and different approaches, often competing and conflicting approaches to sustainability, and the kind of conflicts and contradictions that can emerge from those in different sites around Northern California, including Santa Cruz. And then finally, The City is the Factory, which I co-edited with Penny Lewis here at the Murphy Institute, that's really looking at new solidarities and spatial strategies in an urban age. So kind of building on some of the ideas from these previous projects, and as Sean said, kind of really interested in what the different kinds of urban-based movements are, and potentially very creative solutions could be to getting us out of the mess that we find ourselves in. So I'm going to just start here. So, and you can't really see, but it's yellow, color coordinated, and it says the ecological crisis. And I appreciated that it was framed in these terms. I think often people talk about the carbon crisis and focus on the carbon crisis. As Sean alluded to, there's a long history going back through, eco-socialist literature and up to the point of contemporary period of people talking about the Anthropocene, of thinking more broadly about an ecological crisis that doesn't only include carbon, but also deals with issues of pollution and waste, as well as issues of habitat fragmentation and loss of biodiversity and other impacts on the ecosystem. And so I have here two kind of juxtaposed images, one of mountaintop removal in West Virginia, and another of a megacity in the south of China. And both, I want to argue, are actually part of obviously the ecological crisis, but also very much urban kinds of situations, urban problems, in the sense that, and here I'm using a concept of cities that's not just about a kind of bounded urban area, but a process of urbanization. And this is, a lot of people in urban studies now are thinking more along these lines, that we need to not think of cities as these discrete little entities, but what are the dynamics of urbanization under capitalism? And when one does that, one sees the interconnectedness of a lot of these kinds of spaces. So one sees that mountaintop removal in West Virginia is intimately connected to the growth of these sprawling and polluting urban regions, and that should those urban regions be redesigned, and should there be a different kind of politics that redesign those regions also to benefit the majority of their inhabitants and keep them closer to their jobs in the urban core through affordable housing, one wouldn't need to remove as many mountaintops and have as much and produce as much energy as Sean was alluding to, the issue of energy production. One could, if one focuses on the climate crisis, say that cities are responsible for 70, or urbanization processes are responsible for 70% of carbon emissions through this dynamic. And so, I feel like it's a really good place to start thinking about these interconnected spaces as well as dynamics of ecological crisis. And again, so cities are both understood to be primary culprits as well as victims. And one sees with, the kind of famous statistics around planetary urbanization, the urban revolution, the urban age, however you want to put it, that cities are now primarily growing. You can see major areas of growth in the global south, and are primarily growing. So 50% of the world's population now is urban, and 75% is predicted to be urban in 2025. Meanwhile, those are all almost entirely on coasts around the world. So in terms of the vulnerability that this places urban infrastructure, urban economies, as well as, of course, urban ecologies and urban populations, is enormous. It's enormous. And I just wanted to, there's a lot of statistics about this, but it's estimated that, and it's interestingly similar to these other statistics, 50% of the population of the world is going to lives within 120 miles of the sea, and by 2025, again, that will reach 75%. And so the question of how this creates an environment of just increasing likelihood of natural disasters striking, and of those disasters being transformed into crises, is a really important one to consider, and having a potentially lethal and dislocating effect in the process. And we could have another and longer conversation about the impact of inundated cities on climate refugees and dynamics along these lines. But I wanted to focus in on a few urban examples here. So I'm going to go to some work from the New Orleans and New York project. These are some images from Katrina in New Orleans. And here I just really want to emphasize that while cities are on the front lines of the climate crisis and the ecological crisis, it's an unevenly distributed risk. And one of the ideas that we really worked with in the book was on uneven landscapes of risk and resilience. So there are certain parts of these cities that are going to fare better, or have fared better in the face of these crises than others. And that it's not always so simple as to say, for instance, that low-income populations, disproportionately people of color, are living in the lowest lying areas and living the closest to the coast. And sometimes that can kind of confuse things, because in the case of New Orleans, for instance, we compared two neighborhoods. One was Lakeview, which is on the left, and the other was the Lower Ninth Ward. And Lakeview is primarily upper income neighborhood with single family homes, and Lower Ninth Ward is primarily low income with multifamily apartment complexes and single family homes. And both faced 10 to 12 feet of flooding after Katrina. Both were in proximity to levees that were that failed and were close to large bodies of water. And one should note that often there's a premium placed, as you can imagine, with the name Lakeview, which was built in the late 19th century, primarily for that purpose of being close to the water, right? And so there's a premium placed on coastal real estate. There's all kinds of insurance, obviously, as we know, given to coastal real estate. So there's all kinds of different folks living in proximity to these kinds of disasters. However, it's not the case that they're able to recover in the same way. And so we also then compared the disparity in the capacity for these two communities to bounce back, which is the language around resiliency. And one sees that in the case of Lakeview, it's one of the kind of celebrated case studies in terms of the rebuilding effort that occurred there as compared to the Lower Ninth Ward, which is, and this is an image from last year, but is relatively, has really about close to half of its built infrastructure and housing has yet to return. And so we really have to think about both uneven landscapes of risk and resiliency and this long prehistory that produced these inequities. In the case of Lakeview and Lower Ninth Ward, different access to insurance, different political connections to people who were involved in the redevelopment effort, different amounts of, different histories of the ability to accrue housing wealth and to reinvest. So we have to think about the different kind of risk that people faced prior, but also what we talk about as uneven redevelopment. So even while you could argue that people are facing these disasters with different infrastructure and different kinds of resources at their disposal, different political connections and so forth, one would hope that with the large-scale efforts that followed Katrina and followed large disasters, in this case $32 billion that went to not only New Orleans but the entire Gulf, that aid, first in the form of emergency recovery aid and in the form of long-term redevelopment assistance and funding through community development block grants and other sources, would then be used to try to mitigate these kinds of inequities and to try to bring everyone back equally. But in fact, the opposite occurred, both in New Orleans following Sandy and in New York City following 9/11, in terms of the communities that were impacted by 9/11 and the disparities between both their pre-existing vulnerabilities and risk, as well as subsequent redevelopment aid that was distributed to the areas that were affected. And so I really feel that it's important to think these things together. I'll leave it there for now. And along these lines, what we saw was really, at the same time, this massive urbanization process that was undertaken with unprecedented for these regions infusions of aid and federal money, private and public, I should say. But in terms of, after 9/11, $20 billion for New York, again, $32 billion, and in a, post-Keynesian era in which we no longer have a lot of funds for cities coming from the federal government, one of the last places where this can come from are through community development block grants in cases of disasters. And so it's this amazing opportunity for cities to undertake all kinds of visionary urban development plans, many of which have been sitting around for quite a while. And the question is, whose plans are the ones that are going to get built? And in the case of Lower Manhattan, and this is something that ultimately was kind of replicated in New Orleans and throughout the Gulf Coast, you had a process of waivers and deregulation of federal monies for disaster aid and recovery and redevelopment that eliminated all kinds of protections that had been in place, for instance, for transparency, for needs testing of aid, for public benefits requirements, and so forth, because they said, well, the primary victims were Wall Street, and the primary victims were people in the World Trade Center, which actually was not the case in terms of the environmental impact, the jobs impact, and so forth of 9/11. But nonetheless, that argument really won the day in the Senate and the Congress, and allowed these waivers to go through. And ultimately, $20 billion went into this redevelopment, with pretty much 90% of it going towards redevelopment for very high-end redevelopment, and some of it going to some kind of public infrastructure, and a tiny amount, around 35 to 50 million, going to the communities on the Lower East Side and in Chinatown who were affected. And that doesn't even include a lot of the folks who were affected who were workers who lived beyond those neighborhoods. But there was a whole movement called Beyond 16 Acres that was trying to really understand, that was led by Good Jobs New York, how we can conceive of this disaster really affecting so many more people. But I just wanted to point out that Good Jobs New York then created this Reconstruction Watch to try to trace all of this, and that's what's up here. on the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation. Okay, so this leads to the whole question of the politics of crisis. Who wins, who loses, who governs the redevelopment, whose voice counts. A lot of this has to do with questions of framing, who gets framed as a victim, what areas get framed as disaster areas, and so forth, and what are all the politics surrounding that definition, but also what happens in the immediate weeks and months and often years subsequent to the disaster to determine who wins and who loses in these situations, and whether we're going to have an equitable and just rebuilding, or whether it's going to exacerbate pre-existing inequalities. So here's a famous image. Does anyone know what this image is from? Goldman Sachs after Sandy. And the lights are still on, unlike everywhere else in Lower Manhattan. And Goldman Sachs, I should say, of the $20 billion that went, was one of the major winners, one of the major recipients, and was able to rebuild its offices and so forth with post 9/11 money. And that leads into also, its role in the economic crisis that in 2008. But in any case, so Goldman Sachs, became a kind of emblem in this building and of the uneven recovery following Sandy, and there was a lot of fear that we were going to see a repeat of what happened after 9/11. And I would, of course, so the title of our session also has to do with Naomi Klein's idea of disaster capitalism, and I think this example was and should be held up as a great example of that phenomenon. And going back even to 9/11 and her argument about how the shock of a disaster can create an environment in which those who are in a position of power can seize control of more and greater resources, and that they can do so in such a way that it can seem legitimate, first of all, because of the nature of the crisis, and it can be harder to contest it politically. But in which they can actually be implementing ideas, and she's citing Milton Friedman here, ideas that were lying around for a long time. So in the case of Lower Manhattan, the Downtown Association and other organizations of financiers in real estate in Lower Manhattan had been dreaming of the kind of redevelopment that happened after 9/11, going back to the 1920s, and even earlier, arguably. We have a historian here. And so this crisis created this incredible opportunity, and we interviewed people for this book who really talked about it in those terms, to transform things. And Goldman Sachs's, kind of pinnacle of light here kind of is an emblem of that. 20 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to kind of hurry here. But if we just focus on disaster capitalism, we miss other aspects of the dynamics of these moments. And I wanted to turn to this idea of radical ruptures. And these are just, some images of early organizing on the Lower East Side and in Chinatown. And one of the, after 9/11, and one of the, the striking things that many of us, I'm sure, who were there at this time or were here after Sandy and have been involved in these kinds of moments, which, given the nature of the precarity of our time, are ever increasing, is the kind of transformative potential of these moments. And so scholars from Britain in the late 70s and early 80s with the rise of Thatcher talked about the idea of crises, in this case economic crises, as periods of both rupture and intervention. And the question of what happens in the immediate aftermath of a crisis becomes really, really sensitive and really important. And here, people really did try to organize pretty rapidly. They also did so in ways that reimagined formerly existing organizations that they had been a part of. And I just wanted to read a quote from actually Matt Ryan, from the former, the predecessor at Align, who I interviewed on this experience. And he said, following Sandy, and he talked about how in that case, there were some relationships that were there prior and were critical to getting things off the ground, but that quickly blossomed into something broader and more intersectional than we had ever seen before. And that was certainly the case after 9/11 and again after Sandy, that there were coalitions that were formed that transcended pre-existing boundaries of the issue of the organization, often issues of neighborhood, issues of race and ethnicity and language. And so all kinds of new coalitions formed. And in addition, the kind of understanding that was the revelation of the scale of the problem that underlay the crisis, the disparity in the distribution of funds, opened up the understanding that there needed to be pretty profound systemic changes brought about, and sort of a larger kind of conception of the need for a society-wide transformation, a city-wide transformation, and also a society-wide transformation to make that possible. And so these are just some groups that were part of LCAN, the Labor Community Alliance, that formed and that had all kinds of good jobs efforts to distribute the money in those ways, the Beyond the 16 Acres. And that you can't really see, but they have people putting money into different jars to show what they think the money should be spent on. And the one with the greatest amount is housing over here. And then the JFK-LIR tunnel, not so much, though that's the one that got the funding allocated. Okay, so so this obviously led into an environment, 10 years later, in which Occupy Wall Street, which really rises in the aftermath of the celebration of the new Lower Manhattan, calls into question a lot of this inequity and a lot of this kind of misallocation of funding, as well as the role of these corporations, of course. But then I also want to just focus on learning from disasters and their aftermaths here. So I mentioned the quote by Matt Ryan. And one of the things that was so striking as we were finishing the book and Sandy hit and people were organizing once again, and they were learning enormously from organizers who had been involved in Occupy, but also who had been involved in Katrina, as well as those who had been involved following 9/11. And there was this really interesting kind of ability to build on the kinds of insights that had been kind of hard won as a result of those kinds of organizing environments. And so one of the first events that I participated in, for instance, with the new Alliance for a Just Rebuilding, went, and you can sort of see they went all the way up Broadway and they stopped at Zuccotti Plaza and then went to City Hall. And this is the website at the time for Alliance for a Just Rebuilding, calling for what was not the case in the previous two disasters. We demand an equitable and transparent rebuilding process. And they were, again, consulting with folks who had been involved, and many of them had themselves been involved. So at the event at Zuccotti Plaza, Bobby Talbert, who is a board member for Vocal New York and part of this coalition, put it, I think, really, really well in a speech that he made facing Deutsche Bank building, where the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation was based. We have all experienced the devastating effects of natural and unnatural disasters in America. And here he's referencing both Sandy and 9/11. The recovery efforts were the disaster inside the disaster. And then he added, the blessing of both tragedies was our ability to learn from these injustices. After Katrina, he said, we vowed never to have the same situation arise on our soil. So, and I think that Maritza is going to talk more about the amazing work of Alliance for a Just Rebuilding, as well as Align, in the aftermath of Sandy. And it was enormously heartening for everyone. It's less important that it was heartening for me after doing that project than it was heartening for so many people involved in this campaign, how they were able to transform these kinds of lessons and this kind of commitment to really some successful organizing and wins. And just to say, in interviewing the organizers, some of the lessons that they learned included that you had to organize early and fast and make big demands. I think that after 9/11, there was a sense that there should be a period of kind of mourning, and that it was somehow impolite, or it was going to be inappropriate to get too political too soon. But that was not the understanding of people organizing at the upper echelons of the political structure. And so here they were like, forget that. We're going to organize from the get-go. And they did. And they made enormous demands. They demanded transparency. And unlike in 9/11, where so much energy was devoted to just trying to trace where the money was going, and all of this organizing resources were going simply to being watchdog organizations, they made demands early on that eliminated the need for that. Also, Obama was president, so that helped. But it was also the case that there was a demand at the local level to make sure that there was ability to track funds, though, of course, that was of limited impact in the case of some of the programs on Staten Island and elsewhere, but we could talk about that. But nonetheless, much of it they were able to trace, and they were able to get $1 billion put into all kinds of jobs for union workers to do retrofitting, to do building, to do all kinds of urban redevelopment projects. They were able to really use this as a starting point for a larger scale campaign, which, an Alliance for Just Rebuilding ultimately was renamed Climate Works for All, and to refocus a lot of the work on green jobs in this new era of climate and ecological crisis. That said, another impact of the future of work and capitalism in this context was gentrification. So we also saw, paradoxically, that many of the areas where most of the money was brought in terms of retrofitting, in terms of new infrastructure, did not include affordable housing limits, did not include needs testing, did not include any kind of regulation of housing, did not include rent control, or higher levels of rent control. And so it also involved a lot of displacement in areas and gentrification associated with the new high-end redevelopment. And these are just some images from Curbed of the neighborhoods in Red Hook that were affected. And the mega project envisioned for Red Hook, which is still kind of being debated, is very similar to a lot of kind of green urban developments that we see in California and around the world, that are these beautiful green and resilient, they're both sustainable and resilient kinds of developments that are also luxury green developments. So the impact of this then also is, in terms of gentrification, is having working class and low-income people have to choose. And this is coming from a project I'm working on now in Santa Cruz, which is similarly confronted with a housing crisis, one of the worst in the country, in terms of unaffordability and disparity in average income and wages and housing costs. Do workers deal with overcrowding? Do they deal with rent burden? Or do they get displaced, and are they forced to commute longer and longer distances to get to work? And what we're seeing is all of these things are occurring, but increasingly commute times for areas in New York, San Francisco, and elsewhere are increasing, and this is contributing to sprawled and polluting and carbon-generating urban environments. So what this calls for then is not simply an environmental movement, but an environmental movement that takes really seriously concepts of right to the city and housing if we're going to confront these issues. And I wanted to kind of end with this idea of the right to the sustainable and resilient city, and movements all over the world. I just included here an image from occupied Sao Paulo. So there's a lot of workers who have some of the longest commute times in the world coming in from out of Sao Paulo, and thus are facing 2 hours of unpaid work twice a day in order to get to their jobs, squatted a building that was targeted for redevelopment for a green rezoning of downtown Sao Paulo, which was going to include all luxury condominiums. And similarly in Seattle, near the Amazon headquarters, unions together with community organizations are fighting for rent control. And they're fighting for rent control, understanding that it's both essential for people's jobs and livelihood, so that they don't have to commute these kinds of distances and they don't have to be facing that particular form of transportation exploitation. But in addition, that it's essential for the environment, and have joined together with the Sierra Club and with all kinds of traditional environmental organizations in doing this. And so, I think I'm gonna end there, and to say that the climate and ecological crisis and the crisis that it poses for capitalism is an enormous opportunity for us to rethink how we build our cities, and in so doing, how we can envision a both just and sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam, for that excellent start. Jacob Remus is from NYU. He looks at this through also the historical lens. He's going to give some comments by way of a response and maybe talk about some of his own work at the same time.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be part of this panel, and I'm going to talk about Miriam. I'm going to highlight some of the things that Miriam talked about and put in context of some of my work. But I want to start with sort of two caveats. One is that I feel a little bit strange being here as a historian at a conference about the future. Historians are not very good about it. Kind of makes us a little itchy to predict the future. We usually get it wrong, so just keep that in mind. And the second thing is, there's this phrase I really like that I stole from someone on Twitter, and I can't figure out who it was anymore, but that there's more to disaster than climate change, and there's more to climate change than disaster, which I'm going to be mostly talking about disaster because that's what I do. But I just want to sort of highlight that and remind us and ourselves of that, because there are a bunch of things that sort of we're not talking about that raise questions about the future of capitalism in regards to climate change. One being continuing and heightening climate migration, thinking about and climate conflict, thinking about the sort of thing that Christian Parenti has written about. Somewhere in the audience, I don't see him anymore. And the ways that the changing ability of people to live and to grow food in large swaths of the world will necessarily have already started to place restrictions or place pressures on the way capitalism has functioned. And the second point is like sort of the more optimistic version, which is to think about what capitalism might look like, or post-capitalism might look like, if we are actually to survive this ecological crisis, and to think about a degrowth economy and an economy that, unlike capitalism, is not based on the constant use of both people and natural resources. But I'm not, so I wanted to flag those things as things that sort of don't fall under disaster, but not really talk about them, and maybe we can talk about them in the discussion period. I also, just as a brief point, there are also obviously disasters that are not climate change disasters, including the ones that I'm actually going to talk about at the end of the talk, because the research that I do is not on climate disasters, or not on anything that people would call natural disasters at all. They're entirely human-made. But also, because this PowerPoint is already here, I wanted to point out this map of cities that Miriam started with, and to point out that not only are these cities largely on the coast, but that many of them are in seismically active zones. And although in rich countries, urbanization has largely meant becoming more safe from earthquakes, in globally poor countries, the opposite has happened. And so that we can, in addition to flooding and other climate-related disasters, even without, there's no reason to expect an increase in the number or severity of magnitude of earthquakes, but we can expect an increase in the human severity of earthquakes in coming years as the urbanization that the global urbanization that Miriam is talking about continues and accelerates. So I want to highlight really three things from Miriam's talk and kind of give them slightly different twists. One is about the inequalities of vulnerability. And crucially, that vulnerability is, as she suggested, socially constructed, right? Vulnerability is not something that certain people are naturally more vulnerable. It is from human processes, starting with capitalism, and then kind of getting to be more specific, thinking about work processes and thinking about where people live and where they are forced to live for a variety of reasons that create these uneven terrains of vulnerability. Related is that disasters, contrary to what we often imagine or are often told in disaster narratives, are not flattening, that they replicate the social cleavages and inequalities that pre-exist in society. And in this context, in the context of this conference, I want to just highlight how every disaster is a workplace disaster for somebody, right? Whether that is something like the chemical factory explosion in West Texas a few years ago, or Rana Plaza, the anniversary of which we just commemorated, or whether we think about the so-called first responders or hospital workers for whom disasters are a workplace event, or whether we think of hotel workers or teachers or hospital or school janitors who work in buildings that take on new important or different importance and different roles in the case of disaster, or whether we think of people performing domestic labor in homes. If we think about disasters as workplace disasters, we can see the ways in which work and different types of work structure the people's vulnerability to bad outcomes in disaster. The second element of Miriam's talk that I wanted to highlight is neoliberalism, right? Is that so she talked about how the hollowing out of the urban state, the destruction of kind of urban funding and urban imagination that in New York we often associate with the crisis in the late 70s, but more generally, it has left us without resources to respond to. So Miriam talked about how disaster then is the few moments in which funding comes into cities. But we'd also point out that we don't have the capacity to deal with disaster anymore, except through military and paramilitary logics and institutions, right? So that we have so hollowed out the state and so hollowed out civil society, both institutionally and also ideologically, that all that we have left are the police department, the fire department, and the National Guard. And that both creates moments, obviously, of repression and oppression that are classed and racialized and gendered in what should be obvious ways, but that they also create possibilities and moments of contestation, right? Different types of contestation that might be possible if the response was civilian-led and civilian-imagined. And that brings me to the third and kind of main point I want to make, which is about the sort of post-disaster altruism or solidarity, the moments of radical rupture, as Miriam talked about. We can think of lots of other phrases that people have used for that. Aristide Zolberg talking about moments of madness, what I call disaster citizenship, which is that because disasters are a moment in which it becomes clear that Margaret Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society was wrong. That disaster shows us that society exists, that society responds, that society is both important to people's literal survival, but also can be rebuilt in these moments of radical rupture. And crucially for me, there are moments in which people contest citizenship. People contest and argue about and enact different obligations to each other and to their societies. And to me, this is kind of the optimist. I'm not usually very much of an optimist, but this is sort of the way that as someone who studies disaster and therefore sort of constantly thinking about pain and suffering and unhappiness, that I maintain my own sense of hope and optimism, is that when there are these moments, and I think, as we've been talking about, ever increasing numbers and visibilities of these moments of contestation, we can imagine different futures. So I just want to highlight sort of 3 different ways in which these contestations happen, because they happen on many different levels, right? Workers and their employers, within families, citizens to their community or to their state. So I'm just going to tell 3 very short stories that come from my own research. These happen to come from a munitions ship explosion in Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1917. The details of which don't matter, although I'm a historian. I'm always happy to bore you with details if you have questions. So just to think about that worker-employer relationship. In Halifax, about a quarter of the city was destroyed by this explosion, which included a lot of houses. And so the question was, who is going to rebuild these houses, right? So the carpenters union had won an 8-hour day. They had won a relatively decent wage during World War I. But all of a sudden, they were faced with this swarm of people coming east to Halifax who were going to build houses, and this new pressure on them to accept whatever conditions and whatever overtime they had to do in order to do their civic duty to rebuild the city and relieve the housing crisis. And so there was a months-long argument among not just the carpenters, although the carpenters were the leaders of it, but also the bricklayers and various other building trades unions about what were their obligations to the city and what was the city's obligation to them. And this happens after many disasters, famously also after the Chicago fire in 1871. But in Halifax, the carpenters won. And the Halifax Trades and Labor Congress becomes the largest organization of its kind in Canada, in a not particularly large city, as a result of the organizing that particularly carpenters did of all of these new workers coming in to rebuild the city. So it was this, and then they end up going on strike to defend the right not to work overtime, which is to say that the right to a short hours. And so there was this moment, this successful moment of fighting for a vision of what citizenship would look like, which included the rights of workers and which included, as Peter was talking about in the very first panel, the right to some leisure. The second point I would make is this contestation within families, that one of the things that disasters do, particularly when there is mass death and injury, but not only, is it makes visible the domestic labor that often went or often goes unremarked in ordinary life. So in Halifax, when there was usually a woman, an unpaid woman doing the reproductive labor of the family, who was injured or who was dead, somebody had to do that work. Somebody had to keep house, somebody had to cook, and that meant either hiring somebody or taking home somebody who had been working for wages and contributing to the family economy in a formal waged sense, and then doing this unwaged work. And for hundreds of families, this was such a crisis and made so visible this previously unremarked and invisible reproductive labor that the government actually was essentially forced to step in and give a housework pension to pay people, to pay injured women disability for the unwaged work that they could no longer do. This was very uneven. It was not a perfect system. It was, after all, 1917. But disaster occasioned these conversations, these moments, these contests in which people fought and talked about and thought about what the proper organization of the family and family labor should be. And finally, citizen-state relations. People in every disaster, that's too broad. Historians don't like that sort of talk, but people want relief, right? They want the material aid that will allow them to survive and allow them to eventually prosper. But they want it on their own terms, right? People are very often not interested in giving up their autonomy or their privacy, their power over their own lives, in exchange for this material aid. And so you get people in Halifax, rich people in Halifax who open up their houses during this housing crisis and say, oh, the working class people in the north of the city, they can come stay with us. And it may not surprise you that nobody came, that nobody wanted to go live and debase themselves and live with and take the charity of their rich, not really neighbors. And there's all this hand-wringing. Why are people not doing this? Why are people not living in the shelters? Why are people not taking the aid that we're giving them? And the answer was that they didn't want to be surveilled. They didn't want to be told what to do. They absolutely wanted, they demanded, they fought for cash. They demanded in-kind aid to rebuild their houses. But they were willing to suffer a different type of indignity. They were willing to suffer often living in shacks outdoors in the Canadian winter in order to defend their autonomy and their privacy from both the state and from their rich neighbors. I hope that the lesson of that is obvious, and I think we can see it in thinking about the contemporary non-disaster forms of welfare and the welfare rights movement of people demanding from the state material aid that is both present but also non-coercive. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. I'm sure we all learned a lot and many important insights. So Maritza, from Executive Director of Align, and is up next. Did you going to do a PowerPoint, Maritza? Good.
I'm a little shorter than everybody else, so I'm just going to try to. There you go. Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, everybody at the Murphy Institute for the invitation today. I want to just say thank you for also the work that we have done in the past together and creating these spaces. I think they're really important so that we can actually build community. So there is something that I want to just say as I start talking, and I will show my PowerPoint in a moment when I figure out how this works. But the reality is that we have to define what is the future that we want to live in, right? So at this, oh, you got it? Okay, good. So how do I, oh, so I'm going to start with this one here. Oh, it's, oh, it's stuck here. There you go.
This one, right?
Yep. Perfect. Yeah, it's all right. Okay. So we need to define what kind of future we want. I love the concept and the idea that, you know, the vulnerabilities are created by the system. So the system of capitalism that really want to extract our resources and want to tell us that we cannot actually have ownership, or we cannot have self-reliance as people, right? That we need corporations to be able to lead the way. So I just want to say that first we need to own our cities. We need to ensure that we have policies and we have ability to implement those policies as a community. So that's what I want to start with my PowerPoint, and I want to start with that because it's really important that we think about disasters as a possibility and an optimistic way so that we can actually shift the way our economy works. You know, does anybody here likes capitalism? Let me just ask that question, right? None of us like it, right? So, but we're in it. So we're in it, and we have to do something about it, right? How do we shift it? How do we change within, you know? That's what we have to do. And disasters really can give us that. And we shouldn't be seeing climate as a unique thing, as a silo thing that is just like climate change is affecting just this amount of people in these neighborhoods. Only environmental justice groups are affected by this issue of asthma, not me. Well, that is not true. It's affecting everybody. It's affecting all of us in every single thing that we do in our day-to-day lives, right? So that's one. And two, that it's intersectional. You know, the housing, it was mentioned, right? How do we ensure that people aren't displaced from their homes so that we don't create these disparities because we want to create a green economy? We need to think about how do we do this in a way that is rebuilt with equity? How do we make sure that we move into a renewable economy that actually is an economy that provides access for everybody rather than just for some, right? So I'm gonna get to the PowerPoint, and I wanna start by saying that Climate Works for All, which Miriam mentioned, it's a campaign that was built after the Build the Back program that was implemented in the city. This came out after the Alliance for Just Rebuilding policies that were incorporated after Mayor de Blasio took office. And yeah, I don't want to just talk so much about what was done because Miriam mentioned that, but I wanted to say that the high of that is actually the ability for us to be able to organize people who usually won't work together because we all see the disaster affecting every single person. A union worker lives in the same communities that were affected during Sandy, right? So union workers and workers are community and vice versa, right? So we cannot sort of think about like, oh, well, the labor movement don't care about climate change. Not true, they care, right? To what extent? And how do we ensure that the policies that we put in place are gonna be beneficial for everybody is up to us. So climate needs to work for everybody and climate needs to work for all. So I'm going to start with that, very convenient for us that we have the name of that campaign. But let me just see, how do I do this? Arrows. There we go. But how do I make it wide open? Sorry, it's just like yeah, help is here. Okay, just let's do the up and up. So what we have been doing here in New York is actually thinking more creatively about how can we create a specific kind of policies that will get to that. So I will talk specifically about Climate Works for All first, which is a coalition that has labor unions from the building construction trades, have community-based organizations, grassroots groups. It has groups that are in the environmental justice communities, working together towards a policy that would actually get to some of what we talked about earlier, the retrofitting of buildings in our city. This is not the silver bullet in any way, but I wanted to say that right now in our city, we have a lot of emissions. Do you know where the emissions come from? You have the sheet in there. From buildings. Yes, come from buildings. So what we want to ensure is that about what we know is close to 70% of emissions come from buildings. We have so many buildings in our city. We might live in the same buildings that are actually emanating some of those emissions. And what we need to do is retrofit them. And we need to reduce this use of energy, the energy use in our apartment buildings, in the places where we're working, right? And that's something that we can directly do now. At the same time, protect affordable housing and preventing the rent hikes of apartments, which leads to the green gentrification that was mentioned earlier. And then create thousands of jobs. When buildings are retrofit, then we have the ability to bring like jobs, about 4,000 jobs every year in the city, right? And I want to be clear that when we say creation of jobs, we have to also say for whom, right? The jobs need to be created for folks who have not been able to access to career path jobs, right? So the way we do it in these campaigns is through local hiring. Build It Back was a program that actually did that. And the model of Build It Back was to make sure that there's a targeted local hiring so that when the building trades are getting the market share to be able to rebuild, to retrofit, or do any kind of upgrades on renewable energy, we ensure that there is a pathway for folks who have not been able to access to those jobs in the past, right? So that's the way in which we can transform the way the city has worked. And we were successful with Build It Back, and I think building up from that, we are moving into doing the same with this particular campaign. Well, there's the information that I was just sharing before. So we want to cut the emissions. 80% reduction by 2050 is the goal that the city has put forward. And here in New York, we can do that. So we need to ensure that the buildings are retrofit as much as possible and ensure that by 2050 this is done so that we can prevent future disasters. The other piece I want to talk about is renewable energy and how do we think about it. It was mentioned earlier that there is solar panels, all these great ideas. Like we believe that renewable energy is a good thing. It could be a bad thing if it's not used and done the right way. Right? So the way in which we're advocating the installation of solar panels in public buildings, specifically in schools, is by prioritizing neighborhoods that have been impacted by climate change, what they are called the EJ communities. And if you look in the map you see in the green marks, those are the neighborhoods that are considered the flow zones. So what we had, they agree with the city, they agreed to actually ensure that the 100 megawatts of solar will be installed in all of these buildings in the city, starting off in those neighborhoods, so that there is no disparities, or there is no like this idea of only the people who have the money access to these installations of solar panels. And finally, just to ensure that, again, we have a local hire in place so that these solar panels are installed by people who were never able to access to those jobs through a project labor agreement with the building trades, which we're working on right now. And then the other piece I wanted to just mention is all these pieces are really important, but even more important is just to pass state legislations that can get to the core pieces of all this work. So at the state level, we are part of a coalition called New York Renews. Does anyone know the coalition? Yeah? By show of hands, yeah. So this coalition is focusing specifically on moving us to 100% renewable energy by 2050. There is a policy that's being discussed right now at the state Senate to ensure that that happens. Who knows what's going to happen with the Senate? We are not that optimistic. But if we are to pass this legislation, it will actually create a pathway for us to be able to access to all of these incremental changes in the city and in other parts of the state, which is really critical. Then the other piece I want to just mention in terms of policies is on the polluter penalty, which was mentioned earlier on. How do we ensure when we talk about charging polluters for how much they pollute, we allocate the funds for communities that will be impacted, for workers who potentially might be losing their jobs because we're moving into a renewable energy. So we have this thing called the Climate and Community Investment Act. This is specifically, we believe that we can create billions of dollars by getting all of these polluters to pay their fair share. If this policy is to be passed at the state Senate, we will have a possibility, an ability to just get back what these corporations have taken away from us, which is our health, our community's health for many, many years. And then here is a map that describes specifically what are the specific pieces that we can do with the creation of these jobs. We're talking about building retrofits, public transportation, geothermal energy, industrial efficiency, wind energy, electrical grid, and solar energy. So we are looking at all of those projects that could be incorporated not only in New York City, but in other parts of the state. And hopefully that can provide us with this optimism of how do we move into a real green economy so that we can prevent the disasters coming up ahead. Then the other piece I want to just mention, really going back to the original point about coalition building, which is the work that we do, is just that we need to ensure that we think about coalition building in a different way. So right now, the New York Renews Coalition has about 140 organizations that are part of across the city, right? We need to engage labor much more deeply, not only for them to just support the policies that we're doing, but also to ensure that their membership understand that climate is something that folks need to be thinking about. This is shouldn't be a second thought. Is it reality? Is it something that we are going to be experiencing? We are experiencing today. We experienced last year, and see this as I believe that it is something that we cannot wait to actually take action. There's future of, I have a 4-year-old, and I think about him all the time when I think about climate change. Will he be able to enjoy some of the things that I enjoy today, right? How do we think beyond ourselves when we think about climate change and the intersection of some of those issues? I wanted to end by showing a video of one of the kind of climate change trainings that we did that shows a little bit of the intersection between some of the groups that we work with and the importance of making this work not only in the city but also amplify everywhere. So I'll show you that video because that shows a little bit more of what we are trying to do here. Let me see if I can figure this one out. I think I got it.
Currently, I'm working in the Queens Midtown Tunnel, and that's actually one of the jobs that was really affected by climate change, Hurricane Sandy. And most of the work we're doing right now is a lot of stuff to prevent future disasters in the tunnel.
My dad's been in Local 3 ever since I can remember, before I was born. Local 3's always been a part of my life. I've always taught unionism is the way of the future, is the way to go forward and to protect workers' rights and all of that. It means that we're gonna keep living on this earth for generations to come. I mean, this is home. The whole planet's our home. We need to learn to be able to take care of it.
Por la basura, tenemos que organizarla. Pues el cambio climático, me gustaría que sea un cambio total porque la verdad aquí, desde que estoy acá en Nueva York, casi está existiendo muchas enfermedades. Empezando por asma, la diabetes, la vista también.
If we want to make a building more efficient, we don't start just with changing the bulbs. So we call a company to create a system for the whole building to make it more efficient. So we do the whole thing together. They need to look at the big picture and treat it together. And that's the same way we treat the building and the city, we should treat the planet.
Well, I think we need to do a lot with renewable energy, solar power, wind turbines, water turbines, anything that helps us out, the batteries for the grids. I mean, we're always raised to be prepared in school and be prepared in work. We should be prepared in our lives and make sure that we're able to survive one way or another.
I can go back and educate those who do not know. Even the landlords that have building owners about the solar panel, and I can teach my kids, my grandkids, and those to come. That's what I'm really concerned about.
Especially on my line of work, I do see that they are becoming a little bit more aware of climate change. I'm an optimist at heart, so I always believe that we can always do better and we should always try to strive for better.
Thank you, and I keep it short, so I'm happy to answer any questions, but I do want to invite everybody to participate in any of the campaigns that we're doing, because this is about all of us. This is not only one sector. Thank you.
We have about 45 minutes, I believe, or 40 minutes before the reception. So a little bit of time to have some conversation, questions, and comments. Can I get an indication from, first of all? Yep.
Hi, I'm Lynn Turner. I'm at the Graduate Center in Sociology, also long-term sort of union organizer previously, and also an alumni with the Murphy Institute, and teach here at Murphy sometimes. So my questions are, I wonder if you, particularly Miriam and maybe Maritza, can expand more in how to overcome what sometimes comes up as contradictions in trying to implement the intersection of dealing with the ecological impacts of disaster capitalism, the good jobs and the having good jobs that also are towards a green economy, but also right to the city, and particularly as it comes up sometimes with affordable housing, because that's where the sort of labor interests around jobs and the community interests have sometimes not coincided, and that also relates to some of the issues around the ecological damage. And you also mentioned a good example in Seattle, so I'm interested as why it worked there.
Can I suggest we take several questions and then we can do a quick round? I see a brother over here.
My name is Kofi. My question is that how do we get a lot more support, particularly from the federal government in dealing with this, when in the first place, we can have a simple consensus on climate change at the political level, especially at the level of the federal government, when there is overwhelming, convincing science evidence to back the fact that indeed this is going on. Given that this is the only, maybe in the developed world, the United States is the only country where even though there's overwhelming science, we still do not have a consensus, that one political group believes that indeed it is happening, and another political group believes that it is a complete hoax. So to begin with, how can we have that consensus so that if the labor movement is organizing, they don't get seen as trying to toe one particular political line, or they don't come across as a bunch of leftists who are just trying to propagate a certain political agenda? And thirdly, it looks like all these community-based groups are championing the struggle to deal with climate change. However, how can labor also join in a coalition when most of these foundations, these community-based groups are supported by foundations that don't really like labor? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Question. See.
A long journey. Okay, hold on.
Back all the way over at the back.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether any of the urban...
Name, please, brother.
Sorry?
The name just...
Oh, yeah, Andrew Ross from NYU.
Okay,
I'm wondering whether any of the urban paradigms that have been brought up in the course of discussion, how they overlap with, the latest interest in the sanctuary city. Because sanctuary, expanded notion of sanctuary, at least has to take account, thinking ahead, of migration streams that are going to include climate refugees in large numbers, or at least those are the predictions. And how does an urban labor movement ready itself for those kinds of populations? Maybe the Halifax case study is actually instructive in that regard, although it happened very quickly. And we're talking about a process of decades where we're going to see climate refugee numbers rise and rise and rise. And maybe in Central Florida right now is a good case study because we have seen so many of the refugees from Hurricane Maria come into that region and actually provide a fresh influx of labor for poverty wages for the hospitality industry in particular. So that's just one case study. But cities, of course, are much larger and have the capacity for planning. And as urbanists, I guess we have a responsibility to play a role in that.
Of course. Rebecca?
Thank you. So Rebecca Lurie, I'm here with the Murphy Institute and the Community and Worker Ownership Project. And I've been involved in sort of green job development as part of a fight against climate change or with climate change for years. So the lens I want to offer a question towards is how our humanity can overcome this technological and capitalist I may lack some words, but the morning conversations were a lot about technology, and the middle one was frightening about understanding the technological shifts taking over. And then I have this faith in humanity, and I want to come to that. So when we see people coming together to organize and do something different, I wanted to really cultivate that question, that line of questioning. So I've witnessed a line really come into its own by bringing people together. That video did a nice job of sort of showing community. I want to, and I love the conversation that the historian brought up about Halifax. As a carpenter, I'm particularly passionate about that, because their workers said, we have a better way. So I want to really go back to sort of, and then just some people know the book Jessica Gordon-Nembard wrote about collective courage, looking at cooperatives, post-Reconstruction, and sort of saying when people were most oppressed, what solutions did they find? And then a shameless plug, that's what we're going to talk about next Friday at 3 o'clock here. But I'm just convening that. So I want to elicit that more. When we are most in trouble, how does our humanity come forward? Thanks.
See one, Jennifer, and then maybe we'll come back to the table unless there's other questions or comments.
Hi. Thank you for an excellent presentation. All three of you did a very nice job of really highlighting the crises that we really have. I am very concerned on 2 points because my background is very political. And when I look at what the state of affairs are in our capital, and where a lot of fundamental funding and a lot of policy is set for our country, because this is one area that I don't see how you divide yourself, because the planet is a whole. And when you put yourself as a country in a box and say, I don't even believe it, and that's what's happening in Washington, how do we address that as organizations, as not-for-profits? What kinds of incremental steps do we take, and it impacts on housing, just even to take a look, and some of it is multifaceted. The housing point, I truly believe, can be addressed at the state level, a lot of it, but it's not truly happening because there's so many loopholes that exist for corporate landlords to be able to go after. And it's in my opinion that after Sandy in New York, we saw landlords collect. Nothing happened with a lot of the large buildings until years later. There are people still waiting to have their private houses rebuilt today. So how do we, these are human issues. How do we really address these things? And then, if you do live in an apartment building, they don't only get the monies that they applied for, but then they pass that through to the tenants and call it capital improvements. Mm. So I just wanted to raise a couple of concerns among many.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that. Can we come back to the front tables if anybody would like to respond to any of the questions? I know some were directed to specific, one or two to specific individuals. Please. Yeah.
So what you just touched on is it's critical. And for folks who know the politics at the state level, I'm sure you all are aware, there is a problem in terms of how much these landlords can double dip and sometimes triple dip in terms of getting the resources for themselves to green buildings. And that is a challenge that we have, right? So when we put our policy forward, like we think about those things and we say, well, we want the buildings to be retrofit, but not at the expense of a tenant to have to pay more, right? So we right now are living in a moment where we are trying to negotiate what is the right policy with the city council, because they want to pass a policy that won't take in consideration anything that has to do with the tenants. They don't want to include an exemption. They just want to go ahead and wait until 2019. The best option we have is 2030 to be able to wait until the state resolves the issue of the capital improvements. There is capital improvement funding that landlords can access to. They can do the retrofits, they can do the upgrades in buildings, and that allows and triggers increase on the rent of the tenants. So what you are raising is a really important point. I want to just thank you for saying that. But it is up to all of us, I think, to engage in the conversation with our council members, with people who actually are making the decisions to ensure that there is no green gentrification happening. And yeah, and I don't know, Miriam, if you want to talk a little bit about the housing stuff that you learned. Sure.
So I'm going to try to link some of the questions a bit. I think, well, one thing that's striking me also having, across the three panels today is the need to not take for granted outcomes of potentially terrible new technologies or of disasters. And so it's striking me like no tech fetishism, no disaster fetishism. Like we don't need to assume that because the capacity exists, for instance, to surveil workers in all of these kinds of ways, that technology, needs to be used in that way. And the question is, one of power and control over that technology, but also that there couldn't be other ways of designing technologies that could be liberating in some other way, and so much depends on the social relations surrounding the technology and surrounding our response to disasters. So that's just one point I wanted to make. But there were a couple questions about alliances and the challenges of creating these alliances. And I think that that's true of labor community alliances or alliances with the labor movement more generally. The question over here. There was a quote that I was going to read, and I didn't have a chance, also from someone from Alliance for a Just Rebuilding, by Natalie Allegre, who was one of the lead organizers of the Alliance after Sandy. And she said, in addition to this point about intersectionality that's kind of really coming to the fore after the disaster, that the organizing is increasingly geostrategic in their coalition building, and recognizing that the city was now the factory and that their success in building these intersectional alliances would be tied to their relationships on the ground in neighborhoods across the city. And so it strikes me that Align and other unions, and SEIU and other unions that we work with in California, come to see community groups in a different way in the context of these disasters as well. And I think community groups often, and there's so many different kinds of community groups, obviously, some linked to foundations and some, environmental organizations, longstanding, some grassroots, religious organizations, schools, all kinds of things. But that these different groups often really don't have the kind of capacity to organize that the labor movement does still. In many parts of this country, thank God. And so there's also this, I think that this is something that folks involved in the Right to the City National Alliance kind of contended with, is on the one hand, community organizations who may feel that, labor movement is dominating the alliance, but on the other hand, labor movement who may feel that their role is not being appreciated enough because of the resources they're putting into the organizing. And so there's those kinds of conflicts can emerge. But one of the things that happens in the midst of these moments is this kind of recognition that I think my co-panelists were really pointing to, is of, that we're necessarily in this together, and that, and sometimes that's a brief moment. And how do you seize that moment and transform it into something longer term? one of the things I found with so many of the organizers after 9/11 and Katrina was that challenge of sustaining the momentum of that moment. That was something that many organizations had to return to their, to their member base. They had to return to their kind of daily struggles, their daily emergencies. They couldn't continue this kind of scale of organizing. So something that this scale like AJR and can do is to do that kind of sustaining. I would also say in terms of framing, and the point that was made about how do the housing people and the environmental people, I've been, fortunate to participate in a group at NYU called Democratizing the Green City, and one of my collaborators there, now at the University of Pennsylvania, is Daniel Aldana Cohen, who's done really great work on this question of how in Brazil and in Sao Paulo. So that actually that image of the squat in Sao Paulo is inspired by his work, but he puts it really well, I think, in saying that we need to see workers who are trying to take over buildings in the city center as the other low carbon protagonists. And they don't necessarily see themselves that way. They don't necessarily recognize that actually in trying to take over these tall structures in the center of town and be able to walk to work, they're actually low carbon protagonists. But compared to the technocrats who are trying to take over those neighborhoods and build luxury green developments, they're far bigger and better environmentalists, right? And so how do we reframe like what these struggles are about becomes a really important question. So I would just say that. And there were some other, the question about the sanctuary city is a really brilliant one. And it makes me, it's very provocative. And I mean, one thing in California that's happened is that the sanctuary city movement has very much joined with the housing movement, the rent control movement, which is taking over cities around California right now, including Santa Cruz. And Santa Cruz is a sanctuary city and county. And the state is now actively trying to defend its role in the sanctuary movement with the Department of Justice. And the housing movement has been one of the most active kind of coalitional partners in that. I think, and there's all kinds of reasons that I could go into in terms of what happens when you're precariously housed and you're undocumented to explain that. But that hasn't really happened with the climate justice movement and the question of climate refugees. And I think that's a really, really interesting point, and I want to think more about that and bring that to more people. That's a really important idea. And if you know of any examples of this, you were saying that potentially in Florida this is happening, and that's very exciting. And I think I'll leave it there.
So I'm going to try to answer a couple of these questions. One, actually, two folks mentioned this sort of the climate denialism in the sense of, I think the very correct sense of dread at a political party that controls all three branches of the federal government that does not believe in basic science. But one thing I would point out is that if you actually look at people, so there was a big survey that the Yale Forestry School did last year that was powered sufficiently to look at every congressional district, that a majority of people in every congressional district do believe in climate change. But what they don't believe, that the only place where only in Miami do people believe that do a majority of people believe that they will be affected by climate change. That actually seems like a far bigger crisis to me than whether people believe in climate change in the abstract or not. Because if you believe in climate change but you think you're safe, you're going to be just as much of the problem. And what I would argue that the way around that is essentially what we've been saying all day, which is that none of these things are written in stone. None of these technologies or these questions that appear to be technological or determined are that. That it's all a matter of politics. It's all a matter of organizing. And that where that organizing starts is in some of these questions about housing, some of these questions about jobs. I think some of these questions about health, right? That environmental injustice always is felt primarily in and on the bodies of working people. And that is where I guess I would start that organizing, and to help people understand where they're already being where they are already being affected by climate change and where their children will be even more. And often I think we see that in kind of a real estate lens, right? Like your house will be underwater. But I think bodies is a better place to start. I was just thinking about Andrew's question about sanctuary and climate change refugees. And I kind of have two half answers to that. He's gone. Maybe I'll skip it. All right. So, all right. In that case, I'm gonna say something about how to bring people together and about this technology question. One of the things I say in my kind of normal spiel about disasters is that we are going to see more disasters in coming years for meteorological and seismological reasons, but we are also going to see them more because we can see more now. Right? So out of how many of you had seen a tsunami before 2004 or 2011? Right? Have any of you now seen, do any of you now know what a tsunami looks like because of the hundreds of videos, particularly that came out of Tohoku in 2011? Right? For all of its ill, one of the things that these do is they give us these cameras at all moments and that really shape the way the rest of the world can see disasters. And I don't at all want to be a Pollyanna. I don't at all want to be a Pollyanna. That is very off-brand for me. But I do think that one of the things that new communications technologies can do is to build, even if very briefly, these connections of sympathy and empathy and hopefully solidarity among people at great distance that can encourage people to change their behavior and to build new communities and new politics. One more thing I will say about that to bring it back to history. So Halifax Eastern Canada had incredible amounts of outmigration, primarily in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, primarily to New England. So there were tens of thousands of Nova Scotians in Massachusetts when the Halifax explosion happened, and partially as a result, Massachusetts gave hundreds of thousands, $700,000 to Halifax relief. That more than Ontario, more than anyone else other than the Canadian federal government. And the British government also. But one of the things that did was it created this transnational political community that people in Massachusetts who gave money to the Halifax relief effort wrote letters to the government in Halifax saying, why aren't you spending the money in a better, more equitable, or sometimes more beneficial to my friend way? And people in Halifax wrote letters to the governor of Massachusetts saying, I haven't gotten what I deserved, why not? And the national border, which was meaningful, right? This is 1917. This is kind of the Versailles moment of building the nation state. That those national borders were organized against and around. Even as the states were building them, people were undermining them and using and building this transnational political community in a really useful way that actually got people support and actually got people money.
Thanks for that. I actually want to answer that question around the consensus, because that's where I spend most of my life doing, right? To be frank, like we do coalition building. There is my counterparts over there, Malika from Align, Mariah from Partnership for Working Families, and Nina from Align. So what we do really is that, like we actually are constantly building consensus. And it's not an easy job. It is a challenging job. And I think that's why I love it. That's why I love it, because hearing what are the challenges of our humanity and looking at these issues from the perspective of a human being who will be affected is really critical. So I'm going to be honest with you. When I am organizing around changing the perhaps the state law to move to 100% renewable energy, I do get calls from my folks from upstate, who will be affected by this, from labor, right? So they are like, wait, why are you supporting this? Aren't you our friend? This is going to kill our jobs, right? My conversation with them is not about the jobs that are going to be killed, or perhaps the union that's going to be closing down if we move to 100% renewable energy. But the conversation is, what can we do to ensure that those folks actually get what they need, and how do we train those folks to be able to access to the good career jobs of the future, right? Because we are moving, time goes on, future is moving, right? So let's talk about it, and the incremental changes will get us there, right? So I think in terms of consensus, we're never, ever going to be all on the same page. I think it is a matter of understanding where people are at. Working where people are at is how I believe is the best way of organizing. We cannot impose our policies, which some of them are great. Some of them might have a lot of transformational changes. Some of them might have incremental changes. But we cannot do any of those things without actually understanding where each individual is at. I don't want a utility worker to have to lose their job because they need that to be able to sustain their family, right? And I don't want them to have to choose to 100% renewable energy today or their job. I want them to see that there is a future coming, and we need to work together to find the right ways to do it so that their members, their workers are protected and our environment are protected, because the same workers that we're talking about protecting their jobs are the same exact workers who are affected by health conditions because of the air quality that they're breathing, right? So there is intersection and connection on those things, and the conversations start there. It's not about like the policy and let's just all come together. It is about like, where are you members at? How do we work together in a way that we can protect our entire communities? And in terms of the question around the foundations and some of the community groups that receive money from some of those foundations that are perhaps supported by corporate polluters, I mean, it's capitalism. We are living in capitalism, and that's the reality, right? I mean, it just, you can't avoid it. The things that we can do from the bottom up are really important. And if we can actually make change by ensuring that we're organizing our people from the bottom up, ensuring that we are engaging people from the bottom up, even if I have the $50,000 from a foundation that might have some oil money, or why not, right? What can I do to just make the changes that I need and transform the economy little by little? And then I also want to address the question around the worker co-ops and perhaps the new ways in which we can think about this. So the renewable energy, all the solar panels installations is a great thing I mentioned earlier, and there are some criticisms of how this is becoming this financialization, right? Like, so it can be so profitable for many of these companies to just build the solar panels, exploit workers in China, right? Extract resources, build them up, and then come here and get a worker and pay that worker $10 an hour, and then the profits go to the corporation. But there is ways that we can start thinking about that renewable energy in a way that communities and workers can own, right? There is these ideas of community-owned solar installations or community-owned installations of solar panels. Right now, I think it's happening in the South Bronx. There are communities that are actually doing some of that. So there is opportunities to think creatively. And I think just to say, like, this theme of this is like disaster capitalism. It is sort of daunting and it is sort of sad to think about it. But I want to say that there is an opportunity as well. Like, we do have a moment to just think creatively, innovatively, at how we want to transform our economy little by little with our people, right? We should not let the corporations lead the way. And it's really our responsibility to shift that narrative and shift the dynamic of power. It's not going to be an easy job, and I don't want to say it is, but I think we have an opportunity here today, and we want to protect our future, right? So we got to take action.
Right, well said, well said. I see John at the back, I think 3 or 4 hands now. Can I just do a time check? I think we're due to end at 5:15. Stephanie, will someone close the conference formally, or? No. I can do that? Okay. A new job. Well, we'll take the hands are here. I also want to come in with a comment. John Foster at the back, please.
Each of the panels has kind of ended with the the idea being that we have to organize. And I think that that's absolutely true, and certainly both environmental justice organizations, community organizations, labor organizations all have to be part of that organizing piece. But I want to suggest that in terms of trying to seek a little bit in terms of the reframing of that in a way that may resonate, is I think that this is largely an effort to take back the commons. We had the commons that was the enclosures, of course, in the, what was it, the 1700s in England, I believe, in terms of driving people off their land. But the commons for us now is air, and is water, and is housing, and our hospitals, and fire departments, and police departments are all part of what we collectively should have as commons. And I think as an alternative to capitalism and as an alternative to corporate takeover, to say, no, we need to be in this together to take back the commons that is essential to all of us. So I just wanted to kind of say that. Thank you.
Keep the commons, yep. Okay, so brother here and then brother here. Yep. So we need a microphone over here, sorry. Joe, do you want to come in?
Blair Bertuccini, DC 37 retirees. My question is, given some of the things that were spoken about by Miriam about, you know, the sort of escalating climate crisis and the scientists getting really worried, and what was mentioned by that survey by the Yale Forestry School that most people don't believe climate change is going to affect them. Does some of these organizing efforts like that Maritza is doing, can they contribute to that? Because you're talking about incremental change, but when we look at what's happening, you almost say, well, we're doomed because that's never going to do it. When are we going to get to the radical, rupture that cleans out a lot of what we're dealing with? I mean, because when people start working on, well, I'm greening a building, I'm doing this, so like, oh, things are okay. We're going in the right direction. I don't have to worry. Is that contributing in a way to part of the problem, unless those projects involve some aspect of, well, this really isn't enough. What we've really got to do is, and then you know what to fill in the blank with.
Let's see, is it Marcia at the back over there? And then brother here, and then Joel, and maybe we'll wrap it up. Yeah.
Hi, Marcia Newfield, PSC. I wondered, I came a little late. Did you talk about Puerto Rico? Because I wonder, that seems like the elephant in the room. I mean, none of your systems have reached them. And I love the thing about Massachusetts and Halifax, but Puerto Rico, I mean, it's around the corner and it's dying. And I saw a TV thing where people who never studied electricity are putting up wires and phone lines and what about that? It seems to me there should be a strike about Puerto Rico.
Fair point. Brother here. Yep. And Joel, and then if there's any burning desire to come back, please. I don't know if we have the time. I just was going to close it up.
Hi, David Sokol. Throughout the day, keynote speakers and panelists have used the word they. They did this to us. They are taking advantage of this and stuff like that. So my question is around the fact of exactly who they are, who's the enemy, and secondly, the other elephant in the room, in my opinion, is that decades of good work is being destroyed in a nanosecond politically by things like hiring the fox to guard the EPA henhouse, or they just announced that the gas efficiency rates are going to be held up. So all the work that's being done, and my question is to all the people who are involved emotionally, physically, intellectually, how does the fact that all your good work can be changed because of these political issues? It used to be said that all politics is local. Now it's more a question of all policy is political. because of 77,000 people in Wisconsin, all the work is being destroyed. Everything that's happening at the EPA is being destroyed. All the agencies that were made to protect us are being destroyed. The EPA, created by this guy named Nixon, is being destroyed. How does it affect you emotionally?
I don't think they're going to have a chance to respond to that, but I think we probably know what that response would be. But there's one more, last one, and then I'll make some, and then I'll wrap it up.
Joel Schufro. I was struck on this panel between, Sean, your introduction and the presentations of the panelists. Your introduction laid out a crisis of tremendous scope and immediacy, and with all due respect, I don't think the incremental sorts of changes that we're talking about are sufficient to deal with the problems that we are facing. And I'd say that in all due respect because Align does really wonderful work, and I know that. And so I'm sort of left feeling like we didn't come, this panel did not address those sorts of, the challenge that you laid out, and we need to come back, if we're going to talk about the future of capitalism, to this issue in a real way. I also just wanted to say that Tony Misaki, out of the safety and health movement, always would talk about just transition. He represented, for those of you who don't know who he is, oil and chemical workers. And he would say, I represent people who produce the most noxious, dangerous chemicals in the world. And we would love to shut these plants down. But what am I going to tell my members? He was the president, vice president of the oil and chemical workers. What am I going to tell workers who are earning $25 to $30 an hour, and this was in the 1980s, about their jobs? And unless you have a clear picture of work that will provide them with job opportunities that will match what they are currently doing, to tell them that they're going to have some sort of job training program, that they'll end up flipping hamburgers, is not sufficient. And so I feel like that was a question that was raised earlier this morning when we talked about the comings of robots and how we're going to deal with change in our society. I think it's one of the fundamental questions that needs to be addressed by the environmental movement, and we do not have a clear answer to that question.
Right. Thank you, Joel. If it's okay with the panel, I'll just, I think in the interest of time, and maybe just sum it up a little bit. I want to end with a more optimistic story, which I think shows the dangers of incrementalism. We all want to see progress, whether it's, one small step in the right direction, but we all know that the longest journey begins with the smallest step, but a smaller step doesn't add up to a longer journey. I mean, it's just basically, it is what it is, and it's got to be seen to go somewhere. Now, in South Africa, the government, questionable about its political status, but the government introduced private renewable energy, independent power producers. And the environmental movement applauded it. This is a way to get South Africa off of coal. And the reaction in the last year has been really interesting. The public utility that burns coal, 90% of the power, said, well, if you're telling us we have to buy renewable power into the grid at a higher than market rate, and we're going to pass it on to our customers, then something's got to give. So we're closing down 6 coal-fired power stations, and we're laying off 40,000 workers. It was a move, a political move, to turn the workers against the environmental movement. And the reaction of the unions was really interesting. The largest union in Africa, National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa, said, we will fight to defend the jobs of the coal industry. And the environmental movement went ballistic, saying, we thought you were a progressive union and now you're defending coal. He said, but that's not our position. Our position is we want a planned transition from coal to renewable energy. The only way that can happen is if renewable energy is under social ownership and democratic control. And incremental change will not get us to where we need to go. Having 5% of South African electricity renewables and 95% coal is not going to do anything to protect the environment. And we can move that to 6% to 7%. And the environmental movement was wrong to say private renewables is the way to go. So the union has called for a national strike for just transition, for social ownership of the renewable energy sector, and to reform the public utility so it will move quickly away from coal. Similarly, in Puerto Rico, the union there, UTR, is against the privatization of the public utility, which is dependent on fossil fuels, but it's saying we want a planned transition to publicly owned renewable energy. And this, I think, is a lesson for this region as well. We can support targets. We can support greening of the economy. But if we end up handing over control of the power system to private renewable companies and we sign power purchase agreements 20 years long, we will end up paying a very high economic and political price for that transition. And we have to dig in and start to articulate a vision of public renewable power. And the last point I would say, this is going to come up in Congress. Because if the Democrats do what some people in the room hope they will do, these two bills, Bernie Sanders' bill and the Tulsi Gabbard bill, to get the United States off of fossil fuels by 2050 and to have 100% renewable power by 2035, raises the question, if they ever became law, how could that be implemented without interfering with the private energy markets? And the answer to that is it cannot be implemented. So we need to be really bold and get past an incremental time frame or method while we actually do pursue every possible improvement. We have to have what used to be called a transitional approach to this question. So that's a sort of what I hope is a message we can take away, but that's not really my role now. My role is actually to close the conference. I didn't have much to do in planning this, but I'm delighted to be part of it and be part of this final discussion. I think we should thank the panelists. Bit of round of applause. And also, I only see Stephanie in the room of the main organizer, Stephanie Luce, who's her great work, and Ruth. Is Ruth there? Oh, Ruth Miltman. Yes, thank you, Ruth. So I don't know if you want to say anything before they leave?
Only that, for those of you who stuck it out this long, there is a reception outside with wine and cheese and things like that, so please join us.
Great, great. Well, thank you, everybody, for sticking it out on behalf of the organizers of this event and the Murphy Institute and the panelists. Great. See you soon.
So we do have some wine.